This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Mother's Day is almost here, and you can get her the most beautiful time-tested gift around. A watch she can wear every day from Movement. Whether your mom is into classic dress watches, rare and refined ceramics, or tried-and-true bestsellers, Movement has something she'll love. And right now, everything at Movement is up to 50% off site-wide during their Mother's Day sale. A watch is a gift that celebrates all the time you spent with Mom. And a Movement watch is even more than that. Movement uses industry-leading materials for their fresh, modern watch designs, from technically complex ceramics to vintage-inspired style, all for an incredible value your wrist and wallet will both love. And with one-size-fits-all convenience and fast free shipping and returns, it's a stress-free shopping experience. Save big on the best Mother's Day gift ever with Movement. Get up to 50% off site-wide during their Mother's Day sale at mvmt.com. Again, that's up to 50% off at mvmt.com.
We made this.
Everyone to the X-Cast. The truth is in here. This is our special Fight the Future Minute podcast. I'm Kurt North and you are listening to our coverage of minute 52 of the X-Files Fight the Future. This minute begins at 51 minutes as we see children playing on a Somerset lawn and ends with a shot of London's Royal Albert Hall at 51:59. To discuss this minute, I am joined by podcaster from the 250, Darren Mooney. His first time appearance on Fight the Future, not on the X-Cast itself, obviously, but for this particular feature that we're doing, this is your first time, Darren. So how are you doing?
Hi, Kurt. Long-time listener, first-time caller. But yes, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joining you for this. This is great. And some great minutes to discuss. I think I'll be with you for the next couple of days, hopefully.
You are, yes. You're going to be here for about 4 or 5 minutes with myself to talk about the Syndicate and John Neville in particular as well, especially regarding this minute. But
don't worry, I'll make them feel like an eternity.
Yes, I'm sure you will. But as if this is your first time on this particular feature, we need to kind of get into a bit more nitty gritty about the film itself and what you think of it overall. But two, what you make of it out of 10. And we're not going to do IMDb, so you're all right. And then also kind of what your experience of the film was. Did you see it in the cinema? When did you first see it in relation to the X-Files, that type of thing? So first off, what was your first experience with watching Fight the Future?
My first experience with watching Fight the Future was, and again, this is where I give away my age, I was 11 when it came out in cinemas, which was far too young to see it in Ireland, where I think it was rated 15s. So my dad very, very generously, which makes me sound totally cool. I was totally cool. My dad volunteered to take me to the cinema, despite himself having never watched an episode of The X-Files, which is quite impressive, actually. And I think that was actually a nice little control case for me. Because, my dad, who had never watched an episode of The X-Files, was able to watch the film, follow most of it, found some of the dialogue, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days, maybe a little bit awkward to listen to as somebody who isn't immersed in the world of the X-Files. For myself, I actually quite liked it. I mean, it wouldn't be among my favourite X-Files things ever. I think that there's a certain amount of qualification that has to be made. And I think that a large part of that is largely what I talked about there, which is the idea that this is a summer blockbuster movie. This is the X-Files that's being made to compete with something like Men in Black, as Mulder points out, when you get into, the beginning at the start of the sixth season. But also just in terms of blockbusters like, for example, Enemy of the State or Independence Day, is a huge visual influence on it. And you can tell that, the film is very much pitched at that. And it's kind of a reasonable point. The X-Files was a hugely popular show on television at the time. The most watched episode obviously being Leonard Betts, but even at the end of the 5th season, it was still like appointment viewing for a lot of people. It was still a show that you could casually drop into conversation, people would recognize. Throughout the 5th season, the X-Cast have been referencing things like Catatonia's Mulder and Scully. So, it did have a pop cultural presence, but this was a film that had to be designed for people who had not watched the show religiously, who did not like go on to, and again, in 1998, we're talking about like the World Wide Web as something that is, in most homes or in a certain percentage of homes, but not in all homes, and you certainly can't take it for granted. So you have to make something that is accessible and kind of easy to follow and something that people can parse. And I think I like Fight the Future on those terms. I think as a piece of X-Files, it's maybe a little bit too broad in places. It doesn't have the same focus as the best moments of the show. There's a certain kind of almost cartoonish or crayon-drawn element to it. And I mean, we're going to be talking about that in this minute in particular, because I think one of the things about the minute that we'll be talking about right now is that it's very much like, this is who this character is. This is the character's motivation. Pay attention, because when it's mentioned later, you will want to remember that we have set up this character's motivation in this minute of the film. And there's a lot of that goes in there. Like, there's the sequence earlier on that I'm sure people had a great deal of kind of fun talking about. I'm a key figure in an ongoing government conspiracy, where Mulder summarizes the entire plot of the X-Files through drunken exposition at the bar. And there's kind of that clumsiness there that kind of holds it back from being, for me, like a perfect piece of X-Files. But at the same time, I have a very fond memory of it because it seems, it kind of captures a moment where the X-Files was everywhere, where it was, all over the place, where it was a kind of a huge cultural marker, where everybody was talking about the show, where this little thing that had gone from being, the show that they replaced Searching with. They replaced Searching with this, on Fox on Friday nights. This tiny little low-budget, kind of grimy TV show had suddenly become grown into this thing that everybody was talking about, that was a summer blockbuster. And that, more than the film itself, is kind of what I associate with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but as you say, it has to envelop even cinema goers who might not know anything about the show or whatever, and I totally understand where you're coming from there. So if you were to give it a rating then, I mean, would you rate it as a film or would you rate it as part of the X-Files universe? That's kind of where would you rate them?
Yeah, this is probably more than any individual episode of the X-Files or any part of the X-Files I have difficulty kind of ranking out of 10, assigning a numerical value to, because I think that as a film, I think it's functional, it's accessible, it's fun, but it's rather light. It's kind of heavy on the exposition. It's a bit clunky in some of its characterization. As a film, it's probably like a 3-star film, and as an installment of the X-Files, it's probably somewhere around, say, a 6 out of 10. It lacks the kind of finesse or nuance of the show's kind of best stories and its most insightful observations. But at the same time, again, as that larger cultural thing, I'd bump that up to like an 8 out of 10 or a 4 out of 5, because there's a lot of stuff in here that is very much like, and we say big dumb blockbuster and makes it sound kind of slightly condescending, like a distilling of the iconography of the show down to kind of 2 hours and a minute of change, which I really, really like. And there's a lot of stuff in here, and we'll be talking about it kind of later on, maybe in some of the minutes later on, where the show or the movie manages to offer a vision of the X-Files that, isn't as complicated or as detailed as the show is in its finest moments, but which still hits on some of the basic stuff, the kind of the core fears that underline the show. I mean, again, a little bit outside my own kind of remit, but, when I finish talking about this, we'll be cutting to a scene, which is one of my favorite images in the X-Files, which is this idea of a tomb, a place where people have died and been buried, where something horrible has been covered up, but that's been paved over and replaced with a shiny new playground for kids. And it's like, if that isn't one of the best visual expressions of the core themes of the X-Files, I don't know what is, and I can forgive a lot for that.
Yeah, that's extremely thought-provoking, that really, isn't it? The way that they've done that, and it's a shame that you've ended up being a minute shy of that. So, but
we get like a quarter of a second of it. I think I can go on.
Yeah, this brings us to maybe talking about the episode. The episode. This is the thing about this is that we're so used to talking episodes. The 60 seconds. the minute of the show, I think we need to start looking at the minute itself. So we'll do that right now. Right, okay, so we kick in right at the very end of the last minute, or moving into this scene, we get something that we discussed on season 5, actually, with regards to the Red and the Black and Patient X, where the end of Patient X had the screams of people on fire. You didn't see it. This one's slightly different in that we get the scream of the alien into the cut of kids playing and screaming. Very similar to what you were just talking about there with the having the playground being built on top of a burial ground. That there's a certain kind of allegory there that's like happening. But it does take place in Somerset. It's a very sunny Somerset, and it's not at all Southern California, is it?
It's also not Vancouver, crucially, as well.
It's not Vancouver. And I believe it was Batman's house from 1960s. That's what I'm led to believe. So we do start with that. And you mentioned a bit that just before we kicked in here that the show is trying to, or the film itself is trying to bring these characters into the film universe, effectively, that we see John Neville for the first time. And I think that let's talk about John Neville for a bit as an actor as well, and the kind of chops that he's given both over the series, but very briefly, but in particular in this opening scene that we're getting his kind of backstory, or what type of character he is. What did you think to his place and his role in this minute here?
I mean, again, this is the kind of thing where you're making a movie, so everything becomes very simplified, because you have to deal with the fact that for a certain section of the audience, which is people like me and you, Kurt, we know the Well-Manicured Man. We've been watching him since Paperclip. We've been following his character arc. I mean, we've watched him sort of in episodes like The Red and the Black, even though that wasn't written at the point that they were filming this. But we've seen his background, and we've seen the way he's kind of been developed, and the way he's kind of grown, and the way he's emerged as kind of a more nuanced figure than, say, the cigarette smoking man. He's a man who very clearly has doubts about what he's doing, and has kind of some principles that maybe brush against what he's part of. And the show kind of establishes that, very carefully and very kind of gingerly. There's stuff like, for example, the way that he deals with Klemper when he's talking with Klemper in Paperclip, where you can tell that the Well-Manicured Man doesn't like to be dealing with a former Nazi. He finds it uncomfortable or unpleasant in a way that, say, the cigarette smoking man doesn't. Or the way in which he's very disdainful of the way the cigarette-smoking man conducts his business, leaving mountains of bodies in his wake. And he just kind of finds that a little bit distasteful and beneath him. And I think that, the film, when it's introducing him, for a larger portion of the audience, for people who are not Darren and who are not Kurt, this is going to be the first time that they see this character. This is the defining moment of this character. This is the sequence that tells you who the Well-Manicured Man is and what he's about. And so that's naturally a lot more simple and straightforward than what we've got in the show. I mean, it's worth noting that, Tunguska and Terma implied that he was, for example, possibly having an affair outside of marriage, that maybe his family life wasn't as happy as it appears to be here, as it's presented as sort of idyllic. But at the same time, there's no room for that in the film because he's a supporting character. He's 7th or 8th or maybe even 10th or 12th down the call list when you're looking at characters in the film. So what you get is a sequence of, how do we find a way into this character in narrative terms in the most efficient manner possible? And yes, it is clunky. Yes, it is corny. And yes, it's maybe perhaps a little bit obvious. But again, you go with this idea of family, and you have that juxtaposition, which again, I think the cut is, maybe a little bit cheesy, a little bit corny, but it's the kind of thing you get away with in a blockbuster cinema, where you're trying to communicate as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. So you go from the screams in the cave to the screams of children playing, juxtaposing kind of horror and joy, and suggesting the two are not as far apart as they really should be in the world. And you also have, well, how do we establish that, the Well-Manicured Man is different than the cigarette-smoking man? Well, we introduce the cigarette-smoking man with a low-angle shot getting out of a helicopter and putting a cigarette in his mouth. So let's introduce the Well-Manicured Man in the middle of the day, smiling as he watches his his grandchildren playing out in his back lawn. It's not subtle, but I think it's effective. And it's actually, again, this is one of the things where the film does rather well with transitioning to a blockbuster budget, transitioning to a large budget. And again, you mentioned the fact that this is very much Southern California as opposed to Somerset, but it does feel markedly different than what the show has done in the past. In that, like, you know, obviously Vancouver can double for a large number of locations, but I don't think the show in its first 5 seasons ever looked quite as sunny or idyllic as it does here. And again, that's not to knock the show. I think the show did remarkably well in terms of production. You know, the famous story about painting all the rocks red in Anasazi. But even like if you look at episodes like, say, Our Town, where they find this kind of mock southern house for kind of Our Town, which I was really impressed with watching the show, knowing that it was filmed in Vancouver. But like the use of, say, the California location for Somerset in order to kind of present a lighter world than we're used to seeing in the X-Files, a more peaceful and idyllic world, a world that kind of feels very distant, not just geographically, but tonally, from what we associate with the show, I think works rather well. And again, it's not especially elegant or nuanced, but again, the Well-Manicured Man is... I don't even think John Neville appears on the poster in the small print down the bottom in terms of listed characters. So, like, his character development's going to be very rushed. But I think it covers it very well.
What can we infer here? Because it's 2 girls and a boy who... Well-Manicured Man seems to be watching on proudly while sipping his tea, which is very English of him. He's got to be sipping his tea.
Have you noticed the size of the tea that he has as well? Like, again, this is like the blockbuster budget doesn't just allow us to film in Southern California. It allows us to have proper afternoon tea. It's like, I wonder, like, is he planning on sharing any of that? Because there's only 1 cup, but a whole tray. Yeah,
it does. It's very Southern Californian. When he looks at them proudly. So you mentioned about the grandparents. I mean, one of the questions would be, you know, who do we think the woman is? Is she a servant? Is she his daughter? Where can we fill? What can we fill as an audience? Fill the gap in of who this person is. And you've mentioned there potentially it could be grandkids or whatever. And I think people will take that from what different ways depending on which viewpoint that you have. But when he receives the call of the butler, he obviously seems very pissed off at that point. So he receives this call, and one of the questions that we had was, where do you think that John, the Well-Manicured Man, where in the land of the British government would he be? Is he a lord with all money? Is he a knight of the realm? Is he just a government official? What do you feel that kind of brings forward with this kind of aspect of this British life, with this manor, this kids and potentially servants and butlers and things like that? Where do you feel that comes into it?
Well, that's the thing with the Well-Manicured Man, is that he's an interesting character just in terms of that kind of broader context. Because you look at, say, the way in which the X-Files portrays its kind of conspiracy, and you can see where the various kind of nations fit in there in, like, you know, in a kind of a broader allegorical context. You know, America is the core of the mythology because the X-Files is an American show, but also because America was, you know, the unipolar power at the end of history in the 90s. So it was the kind of guiding force. You had Russia there because, again, Russia had fought America in the Cold War. It had competed for that title of being the unipolar power. It had lost, and then you have the kind of push and pull of the relationship between America and Russia in terms of how what Russia's going to look like in the late 90s going into the new millennium. And then you also have then, you know, the German represented by Struckhold, who we'll talk about in the next minute. But obviously you can't have a German in a movie or a TV show rooted in the end of the Second World War without evoking the specter of the horrors of Nazism and fascism, you know, the Third Reich and the Holocaust. And again, the Japanese conspiracy, which you've seen in episodes like Nicey and 731, which again, you can't have without evoking both the distant horror of the Second World War, because again, the Pacific Theater was the theater that America fought in, you know, primarily, or kind of without the use of, with minimal involvement of the British and French as compared to the European theatre, where they were kind of equal partners in that sense. The Pacific theatre was largely defined by America and Japan, and obviously you had the Philippines, you had British, you had the colonies and stuff like that as well, but it was very much the Pacific War, and, you know, had a particular connotation for Americans, not only because it obviously leads to the dropping of the atomic bomb, so that the involvement of the Japanese in the conspiracy kind of makes sense. The Well-Manicured Man is an interesting character because he doesn't necessarily fit with all that, because he's British, and Britain is a country that has largely had to deal with the fact that it maybe doesn't occupy the same pride of place in the post-Second World War geopolitical landscape that it did during the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries as a global power. And there's a sense of that in The Well-Manicured Man, where he feels like he's a character who is quite literally out of time. And again, it's worth noting that you don't get a sense of the British government being at all kind of complicit or active. You know, there's no discussion of, well, our facility in London has been compromised, for example, or, well, your men were supposed to handle this well-manicured man. There's a sense of the well-manicured man almost being there as a courtesy and out of place. And again, it's kind of weird that they hold the meeting in London, except to emphasize the show's ability to do location shooting now. But I mean, it is kind of interesting because the well-manicured man is consciously framed against the other characters. He's kind of presented as a character who doesn't fit. He doesn't have real henchmen in the same way that, like, the cigarette smoking man grooms his replacement and kind of has assassins working for him around the clock. He doesn't have Quiet Willie in the same way that the First Elder does. Even here, there's a sense of him being kind of put out by having to go to the consortium meeting. And again, later on, you have the moment with the syndicate where he says, I might as well not shown up because that's how much I matter here. And there's kind of a sense of displacement that I kind of like, and I like the ambiguity around that because I kind of wonder... Like, I wonder what the involvement of the British government is in the conspiracy. I wonder if anybody actually cares what the British government's... No, yeah. I mean, you know, not to offend yourself or any of the listeners. I don't think anybody cares what Ireland's up to either, in the sense of a global conspiracy involving colonization. But I kind of like the idea that the well-manicured man was almost kind of grandfathered in, and he doesn't have any real connection to the British government. He just happens to have some tangential connection back to, you know, that original incident that happens to mean that he gets an invite to all the meetings. And I kind of like that aspect of it. Again, the same way that you have with Strughold, you have the idea of him being a German who doesn't live in Germany and all the connotations that has. Because you find out that there's a German flying in from Tunisia, and that it also invites all sorts of connotations about, well, what kind of people, you know, are powerful Germans who aren't living in Germany. And I kind of like that aspect of kind of John Neville as, you know, the well-manicured man. And again, it's notable, you mentioned that scene of him where it is idyllic and it is lighter and it is Southern California. It's notable that the well-manicured man, the suggestion that the well-manicured man has a happy family, while it is technically contrasted with, you know, I think some of the subtle implications. It's not like an actual continuity error, but I think it does differ in tone from the sequences that you get with him in Tunguska and Terma. But it sets him apart from literally every other character on the X-Files, every other major character on the X-Files, where familial relationships are defined by their tension, they're defined by betrayal, they're defined by failed father figures. And the well-manicured man is kind of different because he seems to actually believe that he has a responsibility to his children, as we kind of see later on. And his home life actually seems like it's happy. And you can tell from that simple fact that he probably doesn't belong in that room that he's about to go to with those people he's about to meet with. And I kind of like that aspect of it.
Yeah. I think a couple of things that you touched upon there, especially the London thing, because in the past we've always ever seen that all the consortium hidden agendas were always in New York City. And this is very much, you mentioned at the top of the episode here, this podcast, that this is very much introducing John Neville as the well-manicured man, and the way that it's being based in London, that they're really digging down into this like idea that it's a global conspiracy, but there's also people coming in from Tunisia, as you said, that there's. The Americans are coming over to Britain. The meeting's being held in London. Why not Africa? Well, the reason why not is generally because it's more about John Neville's well-manicured man story, not about Strughold, which we'll talk about shortly. But when Strughold's name's mentioned, there's clearly, I mean, we'll get into this when we do see him, but there's clearly weight given to it when Smoking Man says it, that this man is really important. And as I say, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But finally, for this minute, just to wrap up this minute, is that we then see that the well-manicured man has to rush to his grandson's aid because he hears a scream. And for me, that feels like it's a clear attempt to humanize him and to to make you feel a bit more about this character. So what did you make of that final few seconds before we wrap up, and we'll see you tomorrow?
Well, I mean, and again, this is one of the things where the movie is using shorthand. It's not exactly subtle in what it's doing. It's very much going for kind of the emotional kind of way of grabbing you immediately and communicating what it needs to do. It is worth noting, by the way, that the inciting incident for the movie, if you leave aside the kind of prequel sequence set in, was it 35,000 BC, the actual inciting incident in the movie is a kid falling into a hole. Which is a very primal fear. And again, the X-Files is very, very good at tapping into those primal fears. And one of the core primal fears of the X-Files, thematically, is the idea that the elder generation have somehow failed their children, that they let them down, that kind of the radicals who came up in the 60s who wanted to change the world, who wanted to make it a better place, sold out. That discussion that Fox's father has with him, whereas you cash in and your politics become their politics. And even here in the movie you've had this discussion that Bill Mulder was briefly a fellow traveler before he basically sold out and kind of cashed in and became a kind of conspirator. And I mean, one of the things that the movie does rather well is it thematically communicates that idea by putting a repeated emphasis on kids. And again, part of this is just the movie kind of showing its influences, in that the opening minute of the film goes, or the opening couple of minutes go from being an Alien homage to being a Steven Spielberg homage. But it also taps into something very primal where, and again, this is where the audience is as much my dad as it is me. Somebody who has maybe had the X-Files on in the background on television a couple of times, tuned in once or twice when the advertising looked good, doesn't make it appointment viewing. So instead of dad being like, oh my god, there's a man called Strughold, that's the name of the mining corporation from the 3rd season premiere, this is big news, it instead communicates, well, actually, this is a film that on some level is about parents worrying about kids or failing kids or trying to protect kids thematically. And I think that sequence communicates that, inelegantly, but I think it's kind of a beat that you have to hammer very, very heavily. And I think it helps communicate the point that the film's making, both, overall in terms of the show's themes, but particularly with regards to the well-manicured man himself, because again, this is something that comes boomeranging back around, and very, maybe not elegantly, but I would argue efficiently later on. Yeah.
I would say that it definitely introduces it. It's interesting that it's almost exactly a minute that we get to introduce this one character, and it does it, as you say, efficiently, I think is the word. But that wraps up our latest Fight the Future minute. So thank you everyone for listening. I'm sure everyone's having a great time listening to these minutes. We're now into the 50s, so so it's been a few couple of months now. But yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Darren. You will be back for the next minute and the next few minutes, as we mentioned before. So we'll see you then. So until next time, remember, as always, everyone, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Pick a disc.
I think some songs also have all those interludes with samples and spoken word as well. It kind of fits into the shambolic, but in a good way, nature of it.
Yeah, I like the fact that no song ever really ends as such. They're all just the guitars stop and then there's a little bit of electronics that kind of lull you through into the next track and stuff like that. I like it's an organic thing, isn't it? It's kind of like a DJ set where the dude is just obsessed with the one band and he keeps circling back to it.
Pull or pass?
I think it would be really weird if they tried to make the Fantastic Four something that had been around but they didn't get involved in the Infinity War,
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think post-Infinity War, it kind of becomes curious how you introduce heroes in a long-standing, if they were always meant to be there capacity. But
yeah, and unless they have a film set in the 60s and they kill them off. They could do that, couldn't they?
Without a mouse. When me and my wife got married in 2015, we booked our honeymoon to California and went to Disneyland in California. As soon as we decided we were going to do that, I'd always wanted to go there, but mainly for the rides, not for the Disney side of things so much. Yeah. And then I started watching loads of I mean, I know I've heard you mention before, like the Disney Food Blog YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I will sit there when I'm bored. I'm either watching synthesizer demos, random music videos, or stuff about what food not to eat in Walt Disney World, which I've never been to and I'm not that likely to go to in the near future.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network.